David Bohm Seminar Series 1, Sunday, November 13th, 1988, 10 o'clock morning session, Ojai, California.
I could begin with a brief summary of what was happening yesterday afternoon. We'll introduce this idea of thought provides a representation of what you can immediately experience or perceive, and it presents it again, that is, and you can tell this representation. It may be in words or in pictures or in imagination, or say a play is a representation. The players are representing characters. You see, they are not the characters themselves. And you see, then that representation, something we're not conscious of, is that the representation enters the immediate experience. It fuses with it in what I call the presentation. We say immediate experience is presented to us right immediately, but we suppose that it is all coming from the senses or somewhere, but a large part of it is coming from the previous representation. I gave examples. You could give more. You see, for example, this example of an assailant on a dark night, that you see a sort of a vague shadow, but if you have the representation that this region contains people who may assault you, then that affects the presentation. The shadow is presented as an assailant, right? Therefore, your whole adrenaline goes up, and your heart beats faster, and everything. You're ready to do something. And then as soon as you look again, you see that's the wrong representation, and therefore it's presented to you as a shadow, which is quite harmless, right? And therefore it all goes down, right? Now, that's a very elementary example, but it's if you represent somebody as the enemy, again, he's dangerous, and you feel afraid of him. With a friend, it's otherwise. And so on. You see, you represent yourself to yourself. You see, somebody may be, say, a perfectionist. He represents himself as having to be perfect, you see. Or being perfect, right? Therefore, he sees himself, it's presented to him as perfection. And if there's an imperfection, he feels very uncomfortable, right? Or he may say the situation is represented as necessarily perfect, and if it isn't, then it's very bad, right? You see, so it's not merely, he actually feels it. Something is missing, something is wrong, it's disturbing, right? So you actually see it that way and feel it that way. So the representation affects the presentation, and you get what we may call a net presentation, which is the result of the senses and thought and possibly some insight or something else. It all comes together in one net presentation, right? And then you can think about that, right? Right? Now, when you think about that, you may start to represent it again, and it affects the presentation. Again, it keeps on going. Is that clear? Now, you can see there's danger in that some of the things, because you don't know what is happening, some of the things which you're thinking about, as if they were independent facts, may just be thoughts, or the effect of thought. That is, thought gives shape and form and figuration to what is presented. And you tend to think that it's just there, independent of thought, right? For example, you may say the fact that these people are enemies is just a fact. It has nothing to do with our thinking, right? It can never change. Any number of things like that, or suppose something is you represent something which produces a sense of pleasure or relief or comfort in the body, but that is presented as if it were just there. And then therefore, as you think about it, you think, wouldn't it be good to continue that? Therefore, that creates an impulse to keep on thinking that sort of thing, or to think more comforting thoughts, which, wishful thinking, and building the whole thing up. And you see, you don't notice that you are producing the pleasure or the relief or the comfort from the representation of a comforting situation, right? So I hope that's clear then, that this whole mechanism, this whole process contains the distinct possibility of self-deception and confusion if we don't see what's happening, how the representation turns into an experience and presentation, you see.
So it seems this is the basic fabric of our way of operating in the world.
Yes, and we've got to do it. You see, we have got to let the representation become the presentation in order to take action. We can't act toward a representation. You see, you can't act toward the imagination. You see, you have to act toward the thing itself. So you have to see the quality that you are representing in the thing itself. And if it's a mistake, you'll find it isn't working, and you get a shock or surprise, and then you have to go over it again, right?
Like if in a more natural situation, if you were a hunter and you were going through the woods and you saw something that looked like a deer, you would be representing it as something worth hunting.
Yes.
And if it turns out to be a deer and you get it, then that's fine. But if it turns out to be a rock or a tree that looked like a deer, you would immediately go, well,
That's right, yes.
But we somehow moved into a psychological realm where we don't have.
But we have no check by the senses. You see, that way of going about it is all right as long as we deal with something that could be tested by the senses. We get information fairly quickly that we have the wrong representation. But now, as soon as we begin to go into the self, where we don't have any direct sense organs to tell us about it, right? Then we can easily just simply get caught in the representation becoming the presentation, and the self may be built up entirely out of that. Huh?
Most of modern man's activities are based on this kind of representation that they've been able to manipulate the environment to the point that there isn't any other check than the fact.
Yeah, that's right. Even out, you're quite right. Even outwardly, we're finding it hard to check because we have created an environment which seems to fit the representation. So we don't get much information making us doubt it, right?
It's just the same thing. I see something that in the representation, there's what that is categories which are based on differences and similarities. Now, if we perceive that in total and whole, where we understand that the categories of differences and similarities, that there's differences in the similarities and similarities in the differences that we don't see. That's the problem with the representation. If you see that as a whole, now we've created a category, and there's the categories in the representation are measurement and comparison. That's what we do unconsciously. That's where we get mathematics from and thinking from. But if we see that as a whole, as one category, I feel now that it's like a monopole. There's nothing else to relate it to. It's like when I get to that point, it's like my thinking is slowing down or stopping, and there's something outside of that which is, I don't know what it is. It's like it's beyond my thinking. It's a feeling. Is that what you...
Well, you see, I didn't want to go that far. I wanted to say just simply that, take our ordinary experience, we have this representation, and we don't notice how it becomes, it enters into the actual experience. That's all I wanted to say so far, you see. That, and then you see that, and that this creates danger of confusion, self-deception, and it makes the whole thing go wrong. If we could directly see what was happening, we wouldn't be confused. You see, if you could see yourself saying you have a, you see, suppose you make a representation of yourself as good, right, and so on, and it comes out as a presentation. You feel somewhere inside of you is something good and right and true, and and capable and whatnot, or whatever virtue you want to represent. And then you'll feel that way inside. The whole body is set up for that feeling, right? It's comfortable. All the chemicals are working, right? And then somebody else comes along and says something quite different, right? Something insulting. That gives a different representation, which comes in and begins to. Then you see that, you experience that inside, right? Now that upsets the whole system, right? Now, you don't see what's happening, so it seems as if something is going on inside of you which is very disturbing, which is just going on as if your stomach weren't working right or your heart or something, right? In fact, it isn't, right? You see, so you're saying something is disturbing going on inside. You don't see the source in all this representations. You assume it's going on just by itself, so you try to find a way to stop it, right? Yeah. Now then, so you then try to, what you do is you begin to think about it as if it were independent, and you discover that if you think certain thoughts, it gets better, you see, because you don't notice that those thoughts you're thinking are going back into the presentation, right? If you think
a new representation,
a new representation, which will make it feel better, but that may be it may be wrong all around for other reasons, huh?
I need a clarification of the word presentation. Is that which the organism reacts? In other words, if there's a presentation, the organism must act according to that presentation,
that's
whatever
right.
it is.
Yes, whatever is presented immediately, that's the way the organism acts, right? Now, whether it's right or wrong.
Does representation always precede presentation?
No, because you may have primary presentation from the senses and so on. We don't know it from the instincts. We'll try to say that, but it's profoundly affected by representation. By now, we are all in the cycle, so that the presentation includes a lot of representation. Right? We can't stop. There's no way to go back to some supposed beginning where it may not have been so.
It seems what I'm hearing is that in my presentation to you of myself and my interaction with you, I'm presenting myself from my representation of myself.
Yes, and also to yourself.
Is he presenting himself to you?
Well, he's
representing.
Well, he's both. You see, it's both. The presentation includes representation. You see, if you're in an act, you see that's well, the actor. What is he doing? You see, he is both presenting and representing. Right? You see, that is, he is presenting a certain behavior based on a representation. Now, see the point. If we could think that we may be caught up in a kind of act which we don't know we're doing, right?
Presentation. I'm sorry. But
yeah.
Is this? See, he could be trying to present,
yeah.
but what he is actually presenting might have nothing to do with.
Well, it's a representation.
I may be blind to the way I present myself to others, but I present myself to others according to my personal representation of myself, according to how I think.
Yeah, and it's not even personal, but you're also using other people's representations too. It's
all
together.
The question is what happens to that representation or when it goes out in the world, because there's another person perceiving it who has their own act going. And if I don't perceive your act the way you want me to perceive it, then we maybe have a conflict, but there's still all of this activity going on.
Yeah.
It's sort of...
It's you see, and the point is that the presentation includes the representation so fast that you can hardly distinguish them. In fact, we don't, right? Now, but we should notice, for the sake of understanding how it works, that there is a representation in thought, probably implicit, which immediately enters the presentation. I mean, sometimes we can see it happening if we slow it down, right?
Is the presentation neutral? In other words, if there are three observers, do they all receive the same presentation?
No, because everybody, it's interpreted according to his representation of the meaning of the presentation.
So the presentation is it's a manufacture from within.
Yes, it's partly manufactured anyway. You see, the very word fact is the same root as manufacture. So we're saying the fact is made. And you see, and it's made with this materials, as it were, which include some information from the senses, probably some instinct, some of this stuff, and then maybe some insight occasionally, right?
Where would you find this neutral observer? Could judge whether things were seen equally.
Well, there isn't. You see, no. You see, I'm just saying this is the way. Suggesting this is the way it's working. It seems to make sense, and it's clear that it's going to create all the problems that we've been talking about. Or the difficulty, the chaos, right?
You're saying that, I'm sorry.
You're saying that this process of representation, presentation is sort of a necessary, process, but that there is some way that it has gotten out of, that something has gotten out of. I mean, we're not just exploring this because we're just interested in the psychology of the situation. We're exploring this because we see that somehow we've gotten into a very difficult.
Yeah, well, it's clear how we've gotten into it, that we are not aware of how the representation is so intimately related to the presentation.
We represent and present as if it were real or a fact or something that was ordained or...
Well, just simply so, you see, saying that if this person is an enemy or whatever, it's presented as an enemy. You see, suppose we say we have the Jewish-Arab conflict. You see, one group represents itself as belonging to this Jewish nation and the other to the Arab Palestinian, right? Which just is going to come into existence very shortly, I understand. This will be interesting to watch. So at least will be represented as really existing. That's going to make a difference, right? See, until now we've said it doesn't quite exist, right? Now then, once it's represented that way, then it's going to affect the way those people feel inside about themselves, and also how they present themselves, to others, and so on, right? And it's as if they were acting the role, right? But as if they had been carried along so far that they didn't know they were acting it, right? But in fact, acting is a form of representation, right? So
I think I understand representation. I don't understand presentation.
Well, because the representation is presented. You see, the actor may represent. See, suppose we say that the character is represented in the drama itself, in the written score, right? Mm-hmm. The actor then goes through it and thinks it all out and understands that he's represented to himself in some kind of imagination. Yeah. Now, but meanwhile, he may be presenting the picture. Even the imagination already presents a sort of picture of what it means, right? But then when he acts it, he's presenting. He's both representing and presenting. He's presenting. It's as if he were doing it. You see. See, like they say, if you read on the credits, so and so presented in screenplays, presented by. Yeah. You see, it's present means a very simple word. Its root is pre-essent. It means to be in front of. Right? See, the world, everything, our experience is presented. It's sort of in front of us right now. Okay. Immediately, you see. We say immediately everything is presented. Right? Now, then we say, in addition, thought mediates, right? And goes over to represent it. Now, then we say, our culture tends to tell us that which is represented is just there for our information and nothing else happens. But in fact, once it's been represented, then the next presentation includes the shape and form of the presentation. Like if you are told that this is an object you can't quite see and you're told the name of it, you will see it.
Just by shifting the emphasis and pronunciation, present becomes present.
Yeah.
And so the present contains the representation, which is the movement of all of that implicit mind.
Yes.
Filtering and reacting and forming part of our present experience.
Yes, the present now contains the past, right? Which gives, without the past, we wouldn't know anything about it. Right? Now, the very fact we recognize all these things and feel them to be whatever they are is due to the representation, which comes from the whole society. It's collective.
Maybe we could use something like religious art. First, there's like a Buddha. It's a representation of this, but then pretty soon it becomes actually the God itself, which is the presentation.
Yes, that's exactly it. That's the kind of problem that's there. You see, the artist makes a representation of some force beyond, numinous, they call it, a force beyond the ordinary. And he knows it's a representation. Then people bow to it every day and look at it, begin to treat it as something just there. And slowly within their minds, it's as if that numinous thing were presented, as if it were just there immediately.
You use the word manifestation?
Well, no, it isn't a manifestation. It's kind of, see, something which is potential or manifests itself or becomes actual. But see, this is just a matter of things taking shape and form according to the way thought has represented them. You see, if somebody represents a product as good, see, suppose this fellow is selling medicine, he represents it as an elixir that will cure everything, right? If he puts it in glowing terms, and then soon you feel that elixir is really going to cure you. You see, you feel it. There is curative power. When you drink it, you really feel how good it is for you, right? Is that clear? I see a lot of a lot of the deception depends on that sort of thing, right?
So
I, the experiencer, is always experiencing something, regardless of what's going on. I'm sort of like just the experiencer. I'm experiencing something. And in that, I have to do something with that experience. I have to either decide that that's really it or it isn't it. I mean, it's absolute or it isn't in terms of my belief system, right?
Well, your belief system is a representation of reality, right? You see, therefore you will experience according to your belief system. See, if you believe, whatever you may believe, I don't know, if you believe that, for example, I was looking at a program saying that Russians believe, that it showed clearly that their government was just right. And therefore to them, they experienced it as just right. They didn't say this is a representation coming from the state representing itself to be right, but they said, no, it's presented to me, I experience it, I see it as right, you see. I know it, right? And therefore I act according to it unhesitatingly, right?
Well, advertising works on that. Right?
Yeah. Yes, you take a car, they want to sell a car, so they show somebody driving the car through a beautiful country, obviously enjoying himself and being admired by people who are driving with him for driving such a good car. And it's all represented, right? But then it's presented to him in his imagination, right, as him being there with the object of all that, right, and all that happening, right? So he's sort of having a kind of experience of it, or he's imagining at least that if he once gets the car, that's what's going to happen.
Would we say a presentation is a thing then?
Why?
Well, it seems like it's something that we put forward.
Well, the thing is there, you see, this thing is present, right? Now, how does it get there, you see? I mean, how does it get into consciousness as present, right? That's the question. See, if you see a shadow, it's not clear what it is, right? It might be an assailant, right? So if you represent it as an assailant, you really believe it, you are presented with an assailant, whether there's one there or not. Is that clear?
I understand representation, but I don't understand presentation.
No, but I'm trying to say that you're not merely saying I'm imagining an assailant. See, if it were pure representation, you could say I'm describing and imagining an assailant, right? That's all. But when you see the shadow, it's projected right into the shadow an assailant. You're not imagining it.
It's actually presented.
It's presented to you as it will produce all the effects of the assailant, you see.
Like a thing.
It will become like a thing, but
it's not a thing. It's still a shadow.
You see, the point is that a great many things that we call things are that nature, you see. That's what I'm trying to say, right?
Could I give, maybe, is this an example of an actor who had played King Lear, and then let's say this actor got into the role so much that this actor actually started to believe that he was King Lear and his whole life started becoming King Lear.
Yes.
Say somebody who's gone insane
Crazy.
Or something.
That's right, or Napoleon, you see. You see that?
The emperor.
Doctors or lawyers.
Yeah.
So what you're saying is that when you talked about multiple worlds last night, you're saying that really what we're talking about is each individual receiver, you might say, if part of the brain is working like a frequency analyzer, then what we're saying is that the world is really different. We have consensus of opinion about certain things depending on what the meaning is, and that each consciousness is not really separate, but we experience it in a unique way.
Each one of us is doing it to some extent in a unique way, affected by the collective representations, right? So we're able very often to establish a consensus not only about real things, but about things that are not real, right?
There's been soldiers in wars who got what they call frozen limb, their trigger finger. They couldn't use their arm, and 3 months later they were discharged in a hospital. And the presentation to them was that their arm couldn't be used. You could stick a pin in it, they couldn't feel anything. That was frozen limb, because in their representation, which they're not aware of, it just, whatever it did in there, it stopped the perception and the motor neurons for that limb. But later, just out of nowhere, their arm was normal when they were home out of the war. It's the same type of thing.
Yeah, the whole body can be affected by the representation because it's experienced as a presentation. You see that this is the thing. We don't see how this happens, but you can think in terms of neurology of how it could happen, that any thought produces effects similar to the thing that you think about, right? on the whole body, right? That's the only way you could think of, make an image of it, right? So therefore, every thought is bound to produce effects that are similar to this sort of thing, but you can tell that it's coming from a thought very often and not from the thing, right? Like you close your eyes and imagine the room, and you get things going on that are similar to what the room would produce. You see, if something were going on that were disturbing emotionally, it would still disturb you when your eyes were closed, right? So therefore, the representation can produce effects similar to the presentation, but if it's working right, we can tell it's only a representation. But it's in most cases, if it's working in a certain area, we can tell that. But in most cases, we can't, right? It just happens so fast and automatically and unconsciously. And that's necessary in order to be able to use thought for practical purposes.
Just maybe stress that presentation a little bit more. There's a nice analogy that you can make between with a television set and a camera. You know, the camera is connected to the television with a cable, and then the television set takes those signals from the cable and makes an image out of it. And so that the television, the image on the television is not a tree. Say the camera is pointed at a tree. The television makes an image of the tree. Now, analogously, our brains are connected to the external world by cables too, say the optic nerves. And then from those signals coming from the optic nerve, analogous to the camera, the brain creates an image. And that image also undergoes secondary processing by the retina and memory, and then creates an image from that. And that's the image that we see, that image created by the brain. And that's the image that's before us now. We have a kind of a societal myth by saying that the image is before us, in front of us, and we point that way, but in fact that image is taking place inside of us. It's created by the brain, and that image, which seems like a real thing with real chairs in front of us, is what we call the presentation. And in this discussion, we're calling that the presentation. But it's, in another sense, it's an image created by the brain, which we more often mistake for external reality. You know, and part of that image is the idea that it's external and that there's an internal part. So that presentation is very complex, but it's a creation of the brain.
Yes, I mean the brain creates an image which it presents as being out there, right? Now, that will guide action. You see, you have to get a feeling it is out there if you're going to act. You can't just think that picture about the brain and take an action, you see. You say immediately you feel it's out there, and your body moves toward that thing which is supposed to be out there. And if it doesn't find it there, then it says, well, something is wrong with the whole thing, right?
If the representation or the presentation is very grossly off, you would probably...
Yeah, well, like if you had a holographic image of an object and you would put your hand in it would go through, so you say it's not right, you see. So, therefore, the presentation may not be correct. That presentation contained a representation because you saw an image which represents to you a ship, right? A ship is not only something that looks that way, but is solid, right, according to the representation. So therefore, before you approach that ship, you are quite confident that when you touch that ship, it is going to resist, right? And you're ready for it to resist, and if it doesn't resist, you've got a shock, right? Then you say, I've got to look at this again. What is it, you see? Or similarly, take an escalator which has stopped, you see. You represent escalators as always moving, you see, because you generally see them that way. Now here's an escalator that has stopped, but your whole body is feeling it's moving, you see, right? You see it is being presented to you as moving because it is represented. The senses are not telling you it's moving, but the effect of the representation is so powerful that it starts to override the senses, right? You see, so the thing to notice is the power of representation to produce the immediate sense of the thing being there present.
Which is easy to do outwardly, like the deer.
Yeah.
We've all agreed that a deer looks like this outwardly, and that an escalator stops.
Yeah, but it's rather hard even with the escalator to walk down an escalator which has stopped, right? Your body is always ready for it to move, you see. Your legs are walking as if it's moving, you see, and you have to make a special effort to walk according to the fact that it's stopped. You see, now, therefore, your whole system is organized according to the representation that escalators are always moving, right? Now, there's no room in your system for escalators that have stopped, you see. And therefore, it's very hard even to see that they have stopped. So that's one point. Whatever doesn't fit the general collective representation is very hard even to pay any attention to. Very hard. We can easily overlook it altogether.
Maybe a simple example would be when you reach down and pick up an object and think it's going to be heavy.
Yeah.
And grab it, and it's real light, and your body is all predisposed without
you're thrown off,
knowing.
you see.
You didn't make any calculations or make any statements to yourself. You had represented that as a heavy thing. But when you picked it up, it wasn't heavy.
Yeah, it's the implicit thought. Objects of that shape and form and size are heavy, you see. Have always been heavy. And therefore it's represented as heavy. Your body already feels the expected weight, and your muscles are set to pick up a heavy object, you see, and then you're thrown off.
But we have that check, see? You know, we pick it up and we realize, oh, it's not... What I'm saying is, what you said earlier is we don't have anything to give us a check inside.
No, very little. We may have something, but we don't know how to, we're not able to use it at present, right?
Like outside, I know that if I pick this up, all of a sudden I have to reevaluate everything physically, and we can all look at a deer and say...
it's not a stone, yeah.
Right. But inside, there's no role model.
Yeah, well, inside there are no senses. It's much simpler than that. We don't have sense organs inside. You see, we don't have eyes, we don't have ears, we don't have touch. We can't just touch things and try to find out what they're like, you know. We may have a certain sensitivity, though, which I think we have got to develop, you see. We're not entirely, the possibility of looking inside is not entirely absent.
Do you think we were using role models as that check?
No, I think that the check first is to notice something is wrong. You see, you need a sensitivity to notice it's not working, right? That's the first step.
There's been some work done recently in neuropsychology where there was a student who was violent or disruptive in class, and they flashed a word that was 1/10 of a second. It was so quick that he wasn't conscious of seeing the word disruptive on the screen. And they measured the electrical output of the brain, and it showed a whole bunch of squiggles and marks as if, you know, things were going on. And then they flashed it for half a second. And consciously he became aware of it, and it set off his reactions and emotions electrically. But what it showed was that even though we don't see the word being flashed, you pick it up and a whole sequence of things subliminally happen that he was, well, what happened? How come I feel aggressive, or I'm sweating, or my hand, the whole body went in.
Well, that's the point, that there is the thought all about it, which is there before, which represents objects of that kind as bad or embarrassing or dangerous or whatever. And the whole reaction starts, though it hasn't reached consciousness, right? See, so that's the sort of thing that goes on. See, that begins to show how pervasive this, how deep it penetrates, right? You see that it's something that's not easily changed. You see that, and but I did want to emphasize that we don't have sense organs to tell us that this is going on inside, but we do have a kind of sensitivity, nevertheless, which may be important, right? Which we thus far have paid very little attention to. You see, so it may be possible to do something with it, even though we don't have eyes and eyes to look at it and hands to touch it and so on. You see, so but still, by and large, the human race generally is not aware that this is all happening, and therefore we are caught in this process whereby we take what is presented is taken as a fact, which is just there, rather than affected by the previous representation. Right? But all these examples we're showing show that that is not always so, right? It's often not so. And that is enough to explain the trouble that the human race is in. I mean...
Could you explain a little bit now how all of this fits in with what you were saying yesterday about thought of type A and thought of type B?
Yes. Now, you see, thought of type A just does what we've been saying. It thinks about all sorts of things, makes representations, it affects the presentation without our knowing it, and so on. Every time we do something, we engage in thought of type A, right? Without even calling it type A, right? But we are calling it type A for convenience, but it just happens, right? Now, and then there's another kind of thought, type B, which begins to think about thought of type A and how it works. That's what we've been doing now, right? Now this begins to make possible a change. It has begun to make us aware of where the trouble is. Well, as long as we stick to thought of type A, then we can do a lot of things, but some things we can't do, you see. For example, when we see the world going wrong all around, we try to correct it as if it were a problem of type A, right? Namely, the content has to be corrected, you see. There's trouble between the countries, which one is right, which one is wrong, what shall we do, you know, so on, right? But now we're saying that we've begun to reach a stage of saying that it will never be corrected that way. But
type B?
Type A.
Type A.
Yes, the first kind, right? Maybe it'd be better thought of the first kind, huh? Type A sounds better. We could call it type alpha, you see. Be Greek. And then,
And now thought of type B is simply thought about the thinking process.
Yes, it's thought about type A, you see, that, and about the process of how the type A works, you see, and we're discussing that. And we're beginning to, by using thought of type B, we're beginning to see that you can never solve these problems in the framework of thought of type A. In other words,
Can you expand on that?
What?
Can you expand on that a little bit?
Well, you see, suppose we say we have America and Russia and they have a problem, right? They were liable to destroy the world through that problem. Now, I just saw a program video where a lot of Russians in a little city called Vitebsk, they were very concerned about how they'd been invaded by the Germans and how much they'd suffered, and there was constant ceremonies and things to remind them of it. The government organizes them, and they themselves want to do it, right? And it was going on and on and on, right? And you can see the children were singing and going through ceremonies and so on. You can see what they were building up, right? They were building up the notion, we have got to protect ourselves. We are only safe if we can repel anything, right? Of course, exactly the same thought is going on the other side, but it's just different names attached to it, right? Right. Saying that they are the menace and not we. In other words, people sing in the other countries too about their countries and about, building up the notion that it even says we come first and so on. You see, and it's an old story, like Germany used to have a song, fortunately they've given it up. Deutschland, Deutschland über alles. Say Germany above all, right? Now, that means first priority to Germany. That's a representation of Germany, right? As being in the very first place, and the most important, the highest, the best. That's exactly how they thought, right? The children sang that way, that people talked that way, they had ceremonies, they felt we're invincible, we're the greatest, most powerful military force. Nobody can defeat us. And so on. Now that was not merely, that's clearly a representation. But it was a presentation to them, you see, that was present to them. Germany in that form was what was present. And to a certain extent, that presentation created that power in Germany, right? As long as they believed that was really there, they made it there, right? They built up that power. What?
And Hitler made the people believe it.
Well, even before Hitler, for 50, 100 years before, they were building it up, right? Under the Kaiser, you see. So, and the same thing happens in other countries too. But I see that the point is that this German song makes it very, very clear. They said it very, very directly and openly, and they attached a very nice music to it from Haydn, and so on. So they made a very powerful thing, right?
Programmed in the computer, so the children are born with that programming.
No, they're not. You see, we're giving it to them. You see. They're being programmed by doing all that, and they built up the idea that they were a military power. And then when Germany was defeated in the First World War, that was a tremendous shock. They said, how could we, who are so above all, be defeated? They said, no, We couldn't have been defeated. We were stabbed in the back, right? That was a new representation, right?
Are you saying that type A and type B, once type B looks at type B becomes A again?
It's liable to, no, but we're trying to say we're going to hope that won't happen.
Right.
You see.
That's what usually happens, is that it also becomes.
It may fall into that, but let's watch out for that, you see. Now, you see, so anyway, we have all those representations building up, and inside America, inside France, England, Russia, Germany, everywhere, and in Palestine and Israel. So now it's two nations. Now it's both. In a few days, it's going to be called by two names, right? And you can see that to the Palestinian, to the Arab who's living in that area, Palestine is present. As soon as they say it's present, it'll be present, right? And to the Jew, Israel is present, right? Now, they're both present in the same place, right? So there's a problem there, you see. So now that's all building up. Now I'm saying, now people are negotiating and saying, can we have a peace process between Jew and Arab, between America and Russia, or West and East, and so on, you see. But as long as you do all that stuff, what is the point of the peace process? You see, each side is saying, we are right, the others are wrong, the menace is from them. You know, we're building up and saying, we've got to be strong. If we're strong, there's going to be no war. Both sides are saying exactly the same thing, right? So, and I'm saying that in that framework, all you can do is some minor adjustments. You're not going to stop this. You see, maybe things will get a little better for a while, but as long as people sing those songs and keep on doing all that, that problem will remain forever. As it happened in Northern and Southern Ireland, it has gone on for 350 years, right? Therefore, we begin to say, maybe we had better question thought of type A, and say we're now looking at thought of type A with thought of type B, right? Saying that's just what we've been doing.
Maybe the first time that we have a thought type B, being conscious, aware of the thought type B, which is like the investigator who comes to investigate what the thought A is doing so many thousand years. And maybe this is the first time that's happening.
Yeah, well, at least it's relatively recent times. You see, it may have happened occasionally before too, but you see, we now have a crisis where we really have got to do something because the world can really be destroyed by this, you see.
Type B then, I'm sorry. Type B is thinking, reflecting upon itself, not as content, but upon the form and structure. And
that's right, yes. It's type B is thinking, reflecting on thought as form and structure and so on. You see, and now we form therefore a representation of all this, right? Well, as we're doing this, we're forming a representation of how thought works, right? Which is in the words, in the imagination, you know, and so on.
It's the same thought which forms a representation.
What?
It's the same thought which forms a representation about thought.
Yes, but at the moment, at least it's making us aware of something which we're not aware of, you see. You see, this is the important point, that we're not saying that it will solve everything. It's a step. You see, we were not aware of what was happening. You see, we're saying this was a complete mystery, why we did all these crazy things.
If there's a little space in thought B, then we can perhaps watch the process.
Yeah. We don't have to, thought B ultimately may not have to get into that trouble when we come to the question of participation, you see. We're saying that it's because if we stick to thought B as literal thought, about thought, we're going to get into the same trouble. Right, yeah. You see, but for the moment we won't raise the question. We can't put all the questions out at once, right? You see, we'll get muddled up. Right? You see, we have to put them in some order. And so we're saying, look, we have thought of type B making us aware that something has been happening which was not important in early primitive times, namely the representation entered the presentation. But now it has become, the more civilization develops, the more thought we use of type A, the more important it gets.
that representation started being so decorated, the representation started so decorate the presentation that it reached the point to distort the presentation.
That's true. Yes, that's what we're saying. That's exactly what I'm saying, right? But the other point is that we're not aware how this happened. That's the key point. We're not aware that it's happening. You see, that's the key point. That if we were aware that this was happening, we really wouldn't do it. You see, it's too silly a thing for words. I mean, if we could see it as we see this chair really present in front of us, then we wouldn't do such a silly thing. You see. We would use it for when we need it, but we wouldn't produce these representations about countries and Deutschland über alles, and so on. You see, nobody would have done such a thing if he hadn't seen this. Nobody would have accepted it if he hadn't seen the sort of foolish thing that was happening. You see, you see that way of raising children is really destructive and really stupid and is insane, right? If you just reflect on it a little, you see it.
Destructive thing. It isn't just silly.
But I mean,
Dangerous thing.
It's dangerous. It's destructive. It's insane. You know, yes, but we don't see it because it just happens unconsciously, and it seems to be the truth, the fact, the reality. You see, when you sing that song, you really you say, "What a wonderful thing! My country is present in front of me. It's a great, wonderful, good, powerful. It has to defend itself against these people, and there'll be no war as long as we're strong, and so on." Right? Yeah. Yes, we're just remarking that this representation is collective, and the collective representation is powerful for many reasons, not only because one way of testing the truth is to ask if everybody agrees, you see, but another point is just merely having all these people together creates an emotional power and a sense of being together, participation, right?
100,000 people watching the football
Yeah.
game, and they all say number one.
Yes,
and then they go to the Olympics and they run around the stadium and say number one.
You see, there was another.
Same power.
Yeah, there was a book written long ago before the First World War, I think, by Thomas Wolfe, I think his name was, American, who had German origin. He went back to Germany and to the Hitler. He saw the Nazis there. He knew intellectually that this thing was totally wrong, you see. But he went into the beer cellars there and heard everybody singing all these patriotic songs, and he felt he was being carried away, you see. You see that they were participating, they were presenting a picture of all of us together, you know, a wonderful, good feeling.
That's why I question you say a person doesn't, I wonder if a person really doesn't know what's going on. For instance, a mother with her children in Germany, perhaps, if I don't go along with really what's happening, maybe I'll be sent off or killed, or my children be killed. I mean, I think a lot of people have a motivation of survival, not just physically, but psychologically.
Well, I agree with you that some of it is that, but I think unless there were a basis that were unconscious, it wouldn't work. You see, there must be a lot of people who are just carried away by it, or else these other people wouldn't be afraid of them.
In that situation, this presentation is then this will make everything all right, and so the chemistry is saying everything is all right, and so you actually have this feeling of everything all right.
Yeah.
The only flaw being that it depends on something.
Yeah, well, you see, I mean, you could sit in that beer cellar and sing, and there's great participation and comradeship, and, you know, we're all friends together, and we're all going to go out and conquer the world, and so on. It'll all be wonderful, you see. But, you see, when it came to the action, it wasn't so wonderful, right? You see, so they got defeated again, and it was terrible suffering all around, huh?
So in the same way, in what we're doing here, we could make this into a beer cellar.
Yes, well, that's a danger we have to watch out for. You see, we're saying that we have to be careful about self-deception, you see, but see, the same problem is there in every thought, right? The same potential. So we have to watch for it. Now, see, be sensitive. I'm trying to say, how are we going to watch for it? Well, I can't explain to you, but there's a kind of sensitivity which is possible, right? That you sense we're getting into this, right?
I was getting very frustrated feeling now that we realize all these mistakes or see that there can be mistakes all the time without us realizing that we're making mistakes. what then we do, what to do about it. I mean, do we always concentrate on and focus on the fact that we are always capable of being misrepresenting things to ourselves and each other and collectively?
Well, I think we have to go into it slowly. You see, that first we have to sort of this is a tremendous thing, you see, we have to sort of get familiar with it, right?
So if we keep focusing on that, though, we'll never, that will be A again. We'll always turn back into A.
Or perhaps we won't, but we have got to spend some time getting familiar with it, you see.
So subtle, for example, that a mother and father will say, that's my child. Or man lands on the moon in '69, and what does he do? He puts American flag there.
Yes, well, it's the same thing. It's my land, you see, saying that's a representation. Now, when you say it's my land, you feel that it's mine. It's presented in your consciousness as mine, and somebody else may present it in his consciousness as mine, as his, right? And then you have a fight, right? But it's the same thing in Israel. There are two representations of who owns the country. You see, one of them is the Jewish, and the other is the Palestinian. Now, what can you do with that? You see, as long there's no solution. You see, that thought has got to change. I'm not saying there's no way out. I'm saying in that framework there is no way out. You see, you might form uneasy agreements for a little while, but as long as people go on thinking that, well, it'll be like Northern Ireland. I mean, there was periods of relative peace, and then it broke out again, right? You see,
all of this gains its power from a deeper representation that we have of our own existence and of a personal kind of thing. None of this would have any meaning in the world, wouldn't have its power if each individual didn't have his own little representation of his existence and the meaning of it and stuff. It has to move.
Yes, we need to move into this participatory mode, but we can't because we do not realize what's happening. You see, as long as, the difficulty is we have got to make a better representation of what it means to participate, you see, because otherwise we will just slip back into the same old thing. You see, that as they did in the beer cellars. Now, the point is, look, participation means to partake of and to take part in, right? Now, we're always participating whether we like it or not, but part of our thought of type A, especially the literal thought, implies that we are not participating, that everything is just what it is, not really participating, right? And therefore it is presented as impossible to participate.
Are you saying that type A thought has a representation about itself, that it's accurate and complete?
Yes. And that it can be, at least, and maybe it can make some mistakes, but it could aim for that.
And that is inaccurate in actuality?
Yeah. That there's something inaccurate about thought of type A in that way, and very wrong. You see, thought of type A is implicitly engaging in thought of type B about itself, but not knowing it's doing so, right? You see, in other words, we have always been engaging in thought of type B, but we never knew we were doing it. It was like the fellow was always speaking prose, right? But one day he found out somebody told him he was, right? Now.
Are there mistakes in type B also currently in the culture about?
Yeah, because it's the mistakes in the implicit thought about type B which is causing all the trouble. The culture has engaged in a vast number of thoughts of type B which are mistaken. But they're implicit, and one of the big mistakes is that they're not happening at all. That's what it says.
Type B enters memory. This is where it goes wrong.
Well, not necessarily. See, memory is not necessarily a culprit. You see, the whole thing goes wrong. You can't point to exactly where the trouble is. It's only in the whole that, memory is responding wrongly because it has the wrong content. Now, if we remember that, people of that group are inferior, then that will respond that way, you see. So, the whole thing has gone into memory, which helps to keep it going, right? But the thing that went into memory was wrong.
We say that an example would be that Freud discovered type B for the Western world and called it psychology, and it was the mind looking at itself. But in the process, psychology has become a whole adjunct type A thinking.
Yes, well, in principle, Freud made some insights which were type B, right? But then they fell into type A as people started to use them mechanically and so on. But so they became means of adjusting you to society. You see, but also I think Freud did not go far enough in seeing how these collective. See, he was primarily trying to correct the individual in his adjustment to society, but not going far enough in seeing that society itself is the source of the trouble. You see that the trouble originates in collective representations which are circulating in society, and that the thing that is called normal is where the trouble originates.
You wrote Civilization and its Discontents.
Yeah. He had an insight there saying that there was something. He claimed that civilization was against our instincts and would always have these problems, but it's not certain. I don't think it's the instincts. I think it's civilization itself which has based itself on representations of type A and on representations of type B, which it claims it doesn't have. Right?
In a simple sense, I think what I'm saying is limited, but if you just look at type A thought as the symbol versus the reality, I mean, to a point. I mean, it's just like, or anything that we call a thing or a phenomena, as soon as it has that name, it's what we're really dealing with, for lack of better words, is a numeric description rather than the thing or the phenomenon. I could say the sky is there, that is the sky, but that is something which I choose to call the sky. And I just think that, if you begin to look at one way of looking at this type A thought would be that it's the symbol versus something deeper, which we call, for the moment I'll call reality, and then we stand back from that and say, I'm always dealing with a symbol, which isn't the reality.
The difficulty with thought of type A is that it doesn't do that. You see, it says that this symbol is a perfect representation of reality. That's what its mistake is.
Symbol, but if we just treat as we stand back, keep standing back from that, is that symbol, I recognize that I'm treating, suddenly, if we're going to get beyond this and get into type B and not have type B fall back into A. As you brought up, Freud did too, and Jung, but to somewhat lesser extent, because it became more not so ego-based a therapy. And so anyway, I'm just thinking that one way is to look at this type A as a symbol, and we don't want to confuse it in some way. Trying to say is we don't want to confuse those symbols with something which the symbol represents.
Yeah, but it's very difficult to get this clear because, you see, even if we take the phenomenon is what appears. Now, it's what's presented. Therefore, the phenomenon is inevitably affected by the representation. Therefore, the phenomenon is not free of the representation. Now, part of thought of type A says that that part of type A, which is really type B, says it is free of the representation. Right? Is that clear what I mean? Yeah.
Let's say it's a circular movement, similar to cause and effect, that constantly reinforces itself.
Yes, it's going around and around.
The effect becomes the cause.
That's right. The cause is the representation. The effect is the presentation. That becomes the cause of the next representation and builds up. Now, but you see, the point is, it's not being aware of what's happening, not paying attention to it, and so on. That is the real cause of the trouble. That would not happen if we were aware that it was happening. Now, it would not go on, right? You see, so therefore, you see, thought of type A, the phenomenon which appears to us is profoundly affected by the representation. But thought of type A says, no, that is just the phenomenon. But in doing so, it is engaging in thought of type B, right? Implicitly. But without saying so. Now then, so we are saying we have got to go further and, yeah.
Correct me if it's engaging in thought of type B by saying there is no thought involved in the presentation.
Yes, but then that is implicitly thought about thought, right? Yes. You see, by saying this is nothing but a phenomenon, it is implicitly denying that it is a thought, right? And therefore it is saying something about thought. You see, so, but by doing all this implicitly, it can get away. That's part of the magician's trick, to do it implicitly. And it's easier to get away with it then. You see, so, and therefore bringing it out explicitly may be helpful. Now, then I think I'll just make one remark that we have got to get into bringing all this out and how all this takes place, you see, and seeing how we could get to be aware of it, to pay attention to it. And remember what I said, that whatever does not appear in the presentation, you have no way of paying attention to it. You see, and this attention goes to what is in the presentation, you see. So if it is not presented, how are you going to pay attention, you see? Therefore, this thought can prevent attention. It produces inattention. Well, you call it inattention, but that's somewhat of a misrepresentation in the sense that it implies a lack of attention. But what happens is that attention is blocked by the representation that there's nothing to pay attention to.
In the wrong place.
Yeah, and failure, you don't go to the place where it's supposed to go because you represent that place as non-existent.
Like the magician saying, "Watch my hands."
Yeah, he doesn't call attention to what he's actually doing. Okay, I think we should have our break now, and then perhaps we can continue.